It's really no exaggeration to say that without Professor Dunlop's unwavering vision and persistent efforts, the Joint Center would probably not be here today, celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. So this lecture is a small but important way of marking our gratitude for all that he did to help the center pursue our mission of advancing understanding of housing issues, informing policy, and training the next generation of housing leaders. Over its history, the Dunlop Lecture has featured a variety of perspectives on critical housing issues, offering a platform from distinguished leaders from the worlds of home building, finance, government, and advocacy. But until tonight, the lecture has never featured a practicing architect. And so tonight, we're really happy to fill that gap and to end that streak by having Kimberly Dowdell with us here this evening. Looking over the list of past lectures provides a portrait of the housing issues that have been most salient since the start of the century when the lecture series began. In the early years, there was a strong focus on supporting homeownership opportunities, reflecting the national focus at that time on the policy goal of remedying past inequities in the housing market. In subsequent years, affordable rental housing took center stage and the need for a greater balance in federal policy. In recent years, the lecture has addressed the importance of thinking about the role housing policy plays in the context of neighborhoods, as a growing body of social science research highlights the strong association between where one grows up and subsequent life chances. So this year, we're continuing that theme, but with a particular focus on the challenge of how to foster the revitalization of neighborhoods that have been subject to years of neglect. At a time when gentrification pressures are evident in cities across the country, we all too often forget about the neighborhoods in need of targeted investment to create stable, healthy communities for the millions of people living in these areas. As we reported in the State of the Nation's Housing Report not too long ago, between 2000 and 2015, the number of people living in neighborhoods with poverty rates above 40% doubled from 3 million to 6 million, with 1 in 5 people living in urban areas living in such neighborhoods. The growing appeal of urban living holds hope for renewed demand and investment in cities to counter these trends. But it also holds risks that the renewal that takes place won't benefit the existing communities that have lived through these years of decline. In looking for someone who has been a national leader in the field of equitable development who could speak to these issues, and particularly someone from the perspective of the design professions, our search quickly led us to Kimberly Dowdell. In telling her own origin story of her career as an architect, Kimberly recalls as a child seeing dilapidated buildings in her hometown of Detroit and deciding that she wanted to devote herself to fixing the city by fixing those buildings. She started on this path studying architecture at Cornell, then worked in New York and Washington as an architect and as a real estate project manager. Along the way, she co-founded SEED, Social Economic Environmental Design, with the mission to advance the right of every person to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community. Her contributions to public service were honored by being named one of the 100 national leaders in public interest design in 2012 by impactdesignhub.org. But in recognizing that developing solutions to the challenges facing urban neighborhoods required a broader toolkit, she enrolled in the Master's in Public Administration program at the Kennedy School, where she was a Sheila C Johnson Leadership Fellow at the School Center for Public Leadership. From there, she returned to her native Detroit to work first for the city and then as an entrepreneur, joining Century Partners in 2017. Somehow, she also has time to be a lecturer at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture, and since January, president of the National Organization of Minority Architects. But it's her work helping to lead Century Partners that brings together the many threads of her career so far. Century Partners is leading a unique, comprehensive approach to neighborhood revitalization in the Fitzgerald neighborhood of Detroit, in a joint venture with the city, the community, and philanthropy called Fitz Forward. This project includes ambitious goals for redeveloping 100 homes for sale and for rent, and to employ creative placemaking and the reuse of more than 250 vacant lots. But as Kimberly herself has noted, in pursuing revitalization of a community, the approach has to be comprehensive, or else you're just putting a Band-Aid on a wound that goes much deeper than that. And so Fitz Forward also incorporates opportunities for workforce development for residents, for internet access, and for financial literacy classes. And as president of NOMA, she has outlined an ambitious agenda focused on helping to expand the field of African-American architects, who make up less than 2% of the profession in a country where African-Americans make up 13% of the population, with the goal of ensuring that minority professionals can play a role in efforts to revitalize places like the Fitzgerald neighborhood. Speaking as a director of a center that aspires to bring together a broad range of disciplines and professions to address the nation's housing challenges in a holistic fashion, We are excited to learn more tonight from Kimberly about her vision for comprehensive, equitable neighborhood revitalization. We hope her message tonight inspires all of us, but most importantly, we hope her talk and her ongoing work help guide the next generation of architects, developers, planners, and policymakers who will help shape our collective urban future. So it is therefore my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Kimberly Dowdell to deliver this year's Dunlop Lecture.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the Joint Center for Housing Studies for inviting me to give this lecture. So it's good to be back on campus. As was noted, I attended the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I was a fellow in the Center for Public Leadership, and I really enjoyed my my Kennedy School experience. It was just a few years ago, but it was great because it allowed me to interact with so many different people. My class had over 200 people from representing over 70 different countries, which is a lot of diversity. It was a really rich experience. One of the things that people often ask me is, well, if you're an architect, why are you studying public administration, or why are you going to government school, if you will? And I would always say, well, buildings are very much a part of the public realm, and I really wanted to better understand how architecture and public policy, public administration could come together to help shape a better future of the built environment. Another reason why I attended the Kennedy School is because I'm secretly a fan of John F. Kennedy. I thought he was just like the coolest president. And we weren't alive at the same time at all, but there's something about him that was just so cool. I mean, look at that guy. He's like, he was a war hero. He obviously was a really good president. Obviously his life was cut short, but he was, probably most notable for, not only his leadership and his courage, but this is a very notable saying of his, ask not what you can do for your country, or ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I challenge us to think about what we can specifically do for our cities. And one thing that I think is important to note is that I only knew about JFK because he was someone who, even though he, passed long before I was born, he was sort of a beacon of hope in the Black community. In fact, I talk often about spending a lot of time with my grandmother growing up, and she was a very involved church member and was a part of the sick and shut-in ministry. And so she would sort of take me along to visit with some of her contemporaries. So I would visit lots of older Black women's houses in Detroit in the early 90s, and there are a few different fixtures that you always saw on the wall. John F. Kennedy for sure, Martin Luther King for sure, maybe Bobby Kennedy, maybe Malcolm X, definitely Jesus. Like those were like the staples. Of course, their family photos and such, but those are some of the images that I grew up with, and I asked about, who were these people? And so, sort of the passing down of that information was really important. Obviously, it resonated and stuck with me to today. So much so that when I had an opportunity to do my first major research paper in middle school, and this was before Google, this was like before we had like a lot of the fancy technology that we have today, I had to go to an actual library. I had to use the Dewey Decimal System. I had to open the books and photocopy what I wanted to paste with my own bare hands into the research paper. And then I had to type it on this thing, which was a Brother word processor. So we're talking pre-computers. And so it reminds me of just how quickly technology evolves. And I don't know how many people have seen that YouTube video with the teenagers who are trying to use the rotary phone, but they have no idea how it works. That's an image of that. And I remember, I used a rotary phone as a little kid because my grandmother taught me how to use one. And later on, I taught her how to use an iPhone, so it was a nice exchange. But today we'll have a group of people all spending quality time together, and we'll all just be looking at our phones. So it just kind of goes to show how quickly things change. In fact, very specifically, there's a principle called Moore's Law, which talks about how the overall processing power for computers will double every 2 years. And so if you look at 1981, IBM, introduced MS-DOS, and here we are in back in 2007, which is actually kind of a long time ago now, the smartphone came out. And here we are, in 2019, and, things are changing. Apple just had a huge press release or a huge media event yesterday. And so it's, we're constantly going to be confronting major change on a technological front. Technology is so important that it's one of the major things that influences how cities evolve. This is an image by SOM, a rendering really, of the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Roosevelt Island Cornell Tech program or initiative, really, Bloomberg put out an RFP years ago in New York City, about over a decade ago at this point, to really move New York forward as a tech giant. And I mean, obviously New York's doing okay, like it has lots of other things going for it, but it really wanted to take the lead and rival Silicon Valley. And so they invested, billions into this new infrastructure, which is important because technology has such a huge impact on not just the built environment, but how we all interact with one another, and it actually is shaping the future of work. But technology isn't new. This is a painting by Diego Rivera. It's in the Detroit Institute of the Arts. And this painting is from he finished it in 1933, and it depicts the assembly line and just all the automation that was happening in the city of Detroit. And in essence, the technology that was introduced to Detroit is what made the city the great place that it was, and I think that it still can be. We'll get to that later. But just to take you through Detroit by the numbers very quickly, the red dots represent things that are unique to the city, and then the blue dots are sort of personal, little mini personal stories. So the first red dot is 1913, roughly, when Henry Ford invented and the first Model T rolled off of the assembly line. The next dot is around 1920. That's when my great-grandfather moved to Detroit from rural Georgia. Let's see. So then the next dot up here is around the Great Crash, but it's also around the time that Diego Rivera painted that industry mural, indicating that, Detroit is very much, an industry town, obviously the auto industry. Here in 1946, that's when my grandparents moved to the city. And in 1947, they bought their first house on the east side of Detroit. And just a few years later, 1950, that's when Detroit's population reached its max at almost 2 million people. So down here in 1960, that's when Detroit was known for having the highest per capita income of any city in the U.S. And then very quickly, it sort of slid down. But this was another major marker, which was in 1968 when we had the major rebellion. And many cities experienced that, but that's a major turning point, I think, in the city's history. So then I have the great fortune of being born here in the 80s when Detroit had really lost a lot of its resources. And I decided that I wanted to be an architect around this time, and I'll get into that in just a moment, around 1994. And then I ended up leaving the city to study architecture here in 2001. I think most people know that in 2013, Detroit, was the largest city to file for municipal bankruptcies. That was kind of a big deal. And then, of course, I was like, well, I want to come back now. So in 2015, I returned. And here we are over here. And this is a dotted line mainly because I don't know for sure that the population is increasing enough to really move the line. But the census is next year, so we'll see. But fingers crossed that we are getting closer to that. So why did I decide to study architecture? So this is a building in downtown Detroit. And these photos are from long before my time. But this is the Hudsons department store. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this, but it used to be the second largest department store in the world, kind of a big deal. And it really represented a lot of the vibrance that was embodied in Detroit for many, many years, many decades. However, when I was a kid, that's what I saw. In fact, Hudson's closed the year that I was born, so I never actually saw the department store as an active place to shop. But I did see, a pretty desolate situation. No one's around. And when there were people around, they looked kind of sad. And, as an 11-year-old, I remember thinking to myself, well, if we fix the building, then we can, fix the city and everything will be better. I later realized that's not how any of this works. But that was kind of how it all started. So I was like, all right, I'm going to become an architect. I'm going to fix the buildings. And then they demolished it. So that was not ideal. But the architecture bug had already bit me, so I decided to forge ahead. Another part of the architecture story for me is it's more personal. So this is an image of my aunt's wedding photo, one of her wedding photos from 1963. And this is the house that my grandparents bought back in 1947. So that's my grandmother there and my grandfather there. And I actually spent the first 9 years of my life living in this house. And it was a neighborhood that by the time, I came along again in the early 80s, it was pretty decimated by, just the disinvestment that had happened in the city. I'll talk about how that happened a little bit later. But long story short, this was the house in 2011. And then in 2012, it was gone. So obviously that's suboptimal. And, I decided, this is actually not that long ago, but it really inspired me to figure out how do we help to keep other people's memories from being erased? How do we, really protect our built environment and the fabric? And a lot of it is economic. In fact, this is a story that's not just unique to my family, but many Detroit homes, here's an image from 1949 in that same neighborhood in Detroit in 2003. And this is actually an excerpt from my thesis book in 2006. So I studied this as an architecture student to figure out what happened in Detroit and how can architecture help to solve it. And this is just indicative of a larger issue that I think that we should all ask ourselves: how can we turn this around? But one of the main contributing factors to this is redlining. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, but for those of you who are not, around the 1930s and 40s and 50s, there are many policies that created a lot of injustice and disadvantage for people, particularly people of color. And so basically banks wouldn't lend to areas that were in the fourth grade, if you will, or redlined. And so because of that, it really negatively impacted property values. It negatively impacted people's access to capital. And so that in turn resulted in a lot of the disinvestment that we saw in the city of Detroit, and that is currently very much a part of the fabric of the city. And that systemic investment, if you want to learn more about it, there's a really great book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it just kind of goes into detail about all the different things that have happened to contribute to what we see today. But generally speaking, the systemic disinvestment contributes to essentially poverty, and that translates into limited access not only to capital, but to quality education, good jobs, quality foods, transportation, technology, information goods and services, and healthcare. And so it has a real impact on people's lives. So I had the pleasure of coming to the Dunlop Lecture as a student several years ago, and Jonathan Rose gave a talk about ACEs. And I don't know how many people were here for that, but I found that to be a really provocative topic. What's a real estate developer talking about adverse childhood experiences? And when you think about and not to say that you have to be a poor child to experience ACEs, but for the most part, poverty does contribute greatly to to this happening. And in neighborhoods that just lack some of the things that I mentioned in the previous slide, ACEs are they run rampant, and they don't end with just that person. It ends up impacting their children, their children's children. So it's a real problem, and ultimately it can result in early death. I think you can kind of lead all the way up to here, and it's like it has a real cost, in terms of people's livelihood. And so one of the things that so there's good news. You can experience trauma, but also experience resilience, and that's part of how you do that is actually applying equity. So just as a quick story, I had an experience in childhood that is somewhat unique in that I experienced ACEs. I had certain moments with my mother who has mental health issues, who was very well intentioned, but just didn't always do the best job of parenting. And so there were certain experiences that, that I had that definitely resulted in certain levels of trauma. And I think part of that was just not only her mental health issues, but also just living in poverty. So I think one of the moments in my childhood that was perhaps the most, or not the most, but an example of which is being evicted. So as a kid, my mom and I were evicted from, a place that we're renting in Detroit. And if you've ever experienced eviction, it's like a pretty terrible experience, especially as a kid. So, at the time I was in, Detroit public schools, which weren't the greatest. And I remember I had an opportunity to go to a different school, mainly because in one of my mom's, better moments, she said, you're doing really well in school, but I think that you could do better. I think that you could have a better opportunity in another context. And so she worked to get me into a different school, sort of a special school called Gibson School for the Gifted, which no longer exists. But that kind of changed things for me. That created, in essence, an application of equity in my life. So that I think that equity, if I boil it down to its most essential elements, it's making it right. It's, something bad happens and you apply equity and it gets better. And so I went on from Gibson to get a scholarship to go to Cranbrook, which is has a boarding program. So I actually didn't live with my mom anymore when I went to high school. So from 9th through 12th grade, I was able to be in a totally different environment. If anyone has ever heard of Cranbrook, it's like one of the most beautiful places on earth. And so that made things right for me. And I was very lucky. I mean, lots of people experience ACEs and they don't get a chance to go to Cranbrook. So, and in essence, I was able to experience resilience. And I think that cities can have the same experience. I think that cities can experience trauma, and when you make it right, they can become more resilient. And so this is the Hudson site today, basically. I think that architecture can be redemptive. I think that, when you actually invest in places, they can turn around. You can make it right. That's part of what equity does. And now there's a plan led by Bedrock Development. Detroit has a local billionaire named Dan Gilbert, and he is leading essentially a lot of the catalytic development in downtown Detroit. And so this is his project. The design is by Shop Architects, and so the renderings are quite beautiful, and it really speaks to the future of the city of Detroit and what we hope that it will be. We hope that, the equity that is being administered by this, this whole new lease on life for the city, really starts to generate the resilience that we want to see. And so Detroit, I also teach at the University of Michigan, and last year there was a symposium talking about the other Detroit. And I think that, it deserves a little bit of time talking about how, the Dan Gilberts and the Illich family, who are both working, very specifically on downtown Detroit and other developers. Downtown Detroit and Midtown Detroit make up what is commonly referred to as the greater 7.2 square miles of the city. I think it's more like 10 square miles now, but the other 130 square miles, so the total square footage or square acreage of the city is 139. So the 139 square miles, only about 10 square miles are really being invested in. And so that's the yellow area here. There are pockets of strength throughout the city for sure. But really a lot of what we're seeing in terms of really catalytic development is happening in this area. So the company that I work with, I'm a partner with Century Partners. We're working on, we're doing our part to help with, just 4 of these neighborhoods right now. Detroit is a city of many neighborhoods. We actually have 105 neighborhoods. And we're currently focused on building strength on neighborhoods that are already strong. So we're strengthening neighborhoods that are very close to neighborhoods that are strong. And so our strategy is essentially to look at places that have, some vacancy, some blight, and really shoring those areas up. So within a particular block, there could be, a handful of vacant homes. And so what we've done is we've essentially created a real estate private equity fund to purchase certain properties, to rehab them, and then, bring them back to productive life to really fill in those neighborhoods again. And so here's an example. So my partners, David Alade and Andrew Colomb, they started Century Partners in 2014, and this was their first house. And so that gives you a sample of the beautiful building stock in Detroit. And this was a duplex that they bought on a street called Atkinson. And since then, we've collectively purchased, all of these properties that were previously vacant homes that, were falling into pretty great disrepair, but we purchased them and rehabbed them so that they could, live a productive life and host families. In fact, most of our tenants are, young urban professionals who, really want to make their way in Detroit. So it's exciting to see, these places house people who really believe in the future of the city. So this is just a quick example of what we do. So I have the pleasure of managing the rehab of this particular house. We bought it for $71,000, which in a major American city to buy a house for that looks like this for $71,000 is kind of crazy, but it's happening. And we invested about $150,000 into the rehab and sold it for $290,000. So that's just a quick example of how, of how we're doing our work. And this is an image of a 4-unit apartment in the North End neighborhood. That's my partner, David, taking on a big challenge. And that is the property finished. That obviously is much better than having it vacant and not, not being a productive part of that particular fabric. And so because of the work that we've been doing as a company over the last several years, the City of Detroit encouraged us to apply for an RFP, which was basically for the introduction to work on the rehab of 100 homes and the reimagination of 250 vacant lots. And so we put together a proposal with our partners, the platform. So the Century Partners partners here, that's Andrew, that's myself, David, and then our partners at the platform, Peter Cummings and Diedrich Knorr. We decided that we wanted to really approach this from a very sustainable, comprehensive perspective. And so our guiding principles, which are here, is really about, for us, bringing the community together, helping to empower them to help solve their own, work with us to help solve their own problems. I mean, this is a neighborhood that's categorized by a good amount of poverty, but we feel that with the right resources, we can help to stitch it back together. And just for a little bit of context, part of the reason why the city chose this neighborhood is because it's really close to some of the more affluent areas of the city, which are actually in this area, but it's also sandwiched between 2 anchor institutions and University of Detroit Mercy and Marygrove College. And so this quarter square mile area is really our, where we're focusing our work to help create a new model for sustainable redevelopment at the neighborhood scale. So this is just an aerial image, and this shows you a sampling of the housing stock that we have to work with. The city did a park called Ella Fitzgerald Park, and we're revitalizing at this point closer to 260 lots, 100 homes, several of which are affordable. And then we're doing a lot of demolition throughout the neighborhood for houses that just cannot be saved. So this is a quick site plan of what we're doing, just to kind of give you a roadmap of what's happening. So this is the Central Park that was funded by the city, and then all the orange are the different houses throughout the neighborhood that we're currently working on. And this is a good example of a public-private partnership. We work very closely with the city, our partners at the platform, as well as many community organizations that are all, really mobilizing to make sure that this is a viable project. And so here are a few, of course, before after photos that show, the condition of some of the houses that we purchased from the Detroit Land Bank Authority, or the DLBA. And, after several months and lots of money, we're able to turn it into a really beautiful home for this young family. They actually had their wedding, in front of their house or at their house back in October. And so this was a photo of them closing at that point. And this is just, some interior images. This is another before image and an after image. So it's much better after we invest in it. This is a before image, a in progress image, which looks terrible, and after. So it's like so much better now. These are cute little houses that that really represent a new future for a lot of people. One such person is the woman depicted here. This was actually an article that was put out in the Detroit Free Press just last week, and it talks about how few Black people get home mortgages in Detroit, and that's a really it's a really major issue. It's not just access to capital in the form of mortgages, but even on the development side, it's very difficult to secure bank financing, and just lending in general is very difficult in the context of Detroit. And that's actually one of the main things that is going to be required to turn around a lot of the things that we've seen. That's the equity piece that we're talking about, making it right. And access to capital is one of the things that would make things right. And so that's something we have to really, really grapple with. One thing that's important to use as a tool to help combat some of those issues is tri-sector collaboration. I think it's so important that if we want to have a sustainable impact on cities, we have to work very closely as the private sector to work with the public sector and the not-for-profit sector. The three of them, I think, are very critical and particularly challenged places like Detroit. Another thing to remember is that design really matters. Winston Churchill once said that first we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And so it's important that we get it right. And I think design, it's not only important from an architectural standpoint, but good design also transfers to planning. To some extent, I think, in a way, developers are like designers. They're designing a vision. They have a vision for a neighborhood. They have a vision for a building, and they should deploy that vision with a good design team, good architects. But I think it's also just really important to recognize design comes from a lot of different sources, and so making sure that that we're putting things together in a way that's of quality. I think that's really critical, because ultimately that leads to profitability, and profitability is critical for sustainability of a project. I'm not talking about just green sustainability, and that's actually part of good design. That should be just a natural part of it. But sustainability in the sense that this project, Fitzgerald and others like it, can actually maintain and stand the test of time. They should be able to, the properties that we're currently working on, they should, remain occupied. They should, grow in value over time. That's part of the American dream, and we want to see that happen in Fitzgerald. And then we also want to see Fitzgerald become a precedent of what has worked or what can work, not just in that particular neighborhood, but also throughout the city of Detroit and other cities throughout the country. I also feel very strongly as NOMA president that representation matters. And part of good design is having a design team that reflects the communities that they serve. So I became NOMA president 85 days ago. Not that I'm counting. Oh, thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. But this was for the image up top is for my acceptance speech in Chicago last year. And I unrolled my platform, which is All In for NOMA. And the ALL is an acronym for Access, Leadership, and Legacy. And I think it's really important that as an organization, we provide greater access to the profession for K through 12 students, for architecture, college and graduate students, and also for those who are in pursuit of licensure. So that's the A in access. Leadership is important. Once you become licensed, how do you really lead in your profession? How do you lead either in the context of a firm? How do you become an entrepreneur? How do you lead from the public sector, become a developer? There are lots of different ways that you can lead. There are lots of different ways that you can have an impact. And so we want to be able to cultivate that leadership within our members. And then the last L is for legacy. And that's really about making sure that our firm owners, have succession plans and are thinking about the future in ways that they are positioning themselves to give back to future generations. And so representation really matters, so much so that I just have to give some quick statistics. Well, actually, Chris already told you, but just as a quick reminder, no, it's okay. You didn't steal my thunder at all. So this is an image of the Directory of African American Architects. And it shows that there are currently, and this is as of yesterday, 2,272 licensed African American architects. 453 of them are female, and 1,819 of them are male. So I got licensed in 2013. I was the 295th African American woman licensed in architecture, which it's one of those things. It's like if you talk to a Black woman in architecture, you ask her what's your number, and you automatically know because it's a kind of a thing. So 295. One thing that's really interesting about the AIA this year in particular is that the president of the American Institute of Architects is Bill Bates, this gentleman here. And so we have an opportunity to work together on certain initiatives. And in the AIA's 162-year history, he's the second African-American president. And so the AIA has nearly 100,000 members. So it's really great to be able to, tag team with him on different events and working on policy. But he actually told a really interesting story about how when he was, practicing as an architect and touring his fourth grade son's class to see one of his buildings, one of his son's classmates said, "Oh, well, your dad can't be the architect for this building." And so his son said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, your dad's Black. He can't be an architect." And so this was maybe 20 years ago, which is crazy, right? And so it's like we have to think about how representation really impacts the way that we operate in this world. And just because I have to do a quick plug for everyone to come to the NOMA conference in Brooklyn this year, October 16th through the 19th. It's going to be a great time. NOMA is a really great place to really gain mentors and to understand sort of what your opportunities are in the profession. So I encourage everyone to join us. One thing that I often note when I'm talking about diversity is, for me, it's so obvious. I kind of think it's like, the sky is blue. Tomorrow is Wednesday. What else is new? But I realized one day that not everyone can see that the sky is blue. Some people are visually impaired. And so I think it's important that we make the information very accessible to people, and we have to, do what we can to help people understand what's really at stake. And just as a quick vignette of part of the issue, and I know I talked about this just a moment ago, but there are roughly 113,000 architects. When this slide was done, and this is my communications chair, Tiara Hughes, who's a young architect or young budding architect in Chicago. She did this slide, and it talks about how you may see these dots on the screen, but this is actually a dot that represents the percentage. So it's like 0.36%, not 36%. Yeah, right. It's like a visual thing. So I wanted to make sure that it became very clear to you just how much of a disparity that is. And so that's why within NOMA, we focus on the African-American population because that's where the greatest disparity lies. But NOMA truly is for all, hence the other part of All In for NOMA. So I hope that everyone will join us. And then just as a quick story about another industry, technology, as I mentioned before. So Stanford, just launched their Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Their mission was to create, to be the creators and designers of AI, which broadly represent humanity. However, and this is just 5 days ago, they listed 121 faculty members, and not a single one was Black. And so when you think about artificial intelligence and, the future of technology and the future of cities and how that all comes together, like those are the kinds of problems that we're dealing with today, or 5 days ago, which is basically today. So in case you need some tools in your toolkit to help people understand the importance of diversity, there's a really great book by Scott Page called The Difference, and it talks about how the power of diversity creates better groups, firms, schools, and societies. And then the other thing I want to make sure that everyone understands is that, there's also diversity of diversity. So it's like a lot of diversity, but it's important for groups to, have diversity of age and skills and cultures, obviously race, which I talk about a lot, but gender, physical ability, access to resources, streams of income, et cetera. And so those are some of the things that I want to make sure that everyone understands about diversity in the full meaning of the word. And then when we think about the future of cities, they're definitely going to become more dense. They're definitely going to become more diverse. And so how do we square that? How do we make sure that we are applying an equity lens to the work that we're doing? How are we making things right? Just a quick example, the density that we anticipate happening in the world, really. So the world is expected to, so 2/3 of the entire population of the world are actually expected to live in cities by 2050. And so even in the US, we're supposed to go from 300 million to 400 million people by 2050. So where's everyone going to live? That's what I would like to know. And I think it's up to us to try to figure that out together. The other thing that's happening in the US in particular is that diversity is happening. By 2045, according to the Brookings Institute, the majority of the United States will be people of color. And so this kind of shows the approximate breakdown. But I think that's something to note, because a lot of the power structures, currently feature white males in particular. And so how do we understand how things will change as these demographics shift? And also, I think all of us humans have to work together to deal with this guy who's coming for our jobs. So, by 2030, roughly 1/3 of the jobs that exist today are expected to be replaced by automation. So that's something that we have to really contend with. And I think that those of us who aren't in professions and who are most vulnerable will have to really grapple with the future of work. And I think that technology can obviously do great things for us, but we also have to balance that with the basic human needs that we see throughout the country and throughout the world. And so all of this is feeling very stressful. It's like who's in charge here? Who's going to fix this? Who is going to deal with increasing density, increasing diversity, really, really complex issues relative to climate change and all these things. And so I think it's not actually just pointing at me, it's pointing at you too. So I encourage you all to really work together to think through how we can solve some of these problems. And I think interdisciplinary problem solving is a really important thing for us to try to prioritize. So when I was at the Kennedy School, I took a class with Ed Marchant, and he posed the question to the class, what's the golden rule? Does anyone know what that is? And so me growing up in large part with my grandmother in a Christian household, well, I thought it was, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And that was not the answer that Ed Marchant wanted to share. He said, the golden rule is that he or she who has the gold makes the rules. And I was like, oh, okay. So I feel like you can coexist with both of those. I think, do unto others, but also make some gold so you can help influence the rules to, do things that you think are valuable. And so some of the people who can make lots of rules are, the top 3 wealthiest men in America, who actually together have more than the bottom half of us. And so just when you see this information, you think about, the massive, disparity between, those who have and those who do not. And so I challenge us to think about people who are using their access to capital to do positive things. And one such person is Sheila C Johnson. So I have a few Johnson Fellows in the room and others who are affiliated with the Center for Public Leadership. So Sheila C Johnson, she's an inspiration to me, not only because she funded the Sheila C Johnson Fellowship, of which I was one of the inaugural members of the class. That's me there. That's all of our group from that first year. But she also taught us a lot of lessons. She encouraged us to think of ourselves as the CEO of our own life. And I think she's just been a phenomenal example. She's the 4th wealthiest Black woman in the world. which is pretty cool. And she used her wealth to actually, help empower the next generation. Like, she funded this fellowship in an effort to address disparities, or help students, now professionals, address disparities in underserved communities. And so I'm really, proud to be a part of that legacy. And just a quick story about her Salamander Resort. It was actually recently rated a Forbes 5-star resort, one of the best properties in the world. But she had a really, really hard time getting this property off the ground in Middleburg, Virginia, primarily because of racism. They didn't want her there. They threatened her and said specifically, they don't want her to be a part of that community. And so she ended up having to go far above and beyond what any developer would have to do to build the Salamander. But she did. She persevered, and so now it's one of the top properties in the world. In fact, I remember she told us she had to buy that town a water treatment plant. Like, how many other people have to buy major infrastructure just to be able to do work? But she was able to do it. Another example was she saw a Confederate flag in one of the town's little storefronts. And so, being the fourth wealthiest Black woman in the world, she was like, I just bought the building, which is great. And obviously the Confederate flag came down, and it's a really quaint little shop. You should check it out in Middleburg, Virginia. So even with Sheila C Johnson on the team, African Americans are woefully behind in terms of the wealth gap. And if anyone spent more than 12 minutes with me in life, I will have told you the stats about the wealth gap. And so the numbers I usually talk about are around here, where the median net worth of a white family in America is around $117,000. That number for African Americans is $1,700. And that really speaks to a lot of the issues that we're seeing in Black communities, and our inabilities to access opportunities that help us get out of the wealth gap, or not, you can't get out of the wealth gap, but how to increase our sort of status and to close the wealth gap, or to narrow it. But good news I don't have is that if we continue on the path that we're on, African American households are going to hit zero by 2053. So that's 2053. So that's pretty awful. So then what do we do? I think part of the solution, is in real estate. And I think that we have to look at real estate as a tool. I mean, I think there are lots of things. I think access to education, access to quality jobs, equity, making it right. Those are the things that I talked about earlier. But we also have to make sure that African Americans in particular, but everyone in general, African Americans in particular, have to, have a future in the neighborhoods that they've, been a part of for generations. And I think what we see in a lot of places is not so much happening in Detroit at the moment, but I think that, like most places, it could happen where, finally, a neighborhood is getting attention, people are investing, and all of a sudden the people who've been there, typically the more financially vulnerable, like those who have $1,700, are forced to leave. And so, I firmly believe that the absence of blight shouldn't mean the absence of Black people. People of color in particular, really all people, should be able to live in nice places and not be, ultra wealthy. And so I think that we have to do work around ensuring that people can, stay in their homes and live productive lives for the long term. And just as I'm sure lots of people have seen this graphic before, but if you look at the spectrum of access, we've got like Jeff Bezos up here. And then, I think a lot of us are kind of just looking at the action, but so many people of all colors are really way down here. And so how do we not just, move towards equality, which still leaves people out, but equity, again, making it right. And I'm not entirely sure what liberation looks like, but removing the wall seems like a good place to start. So I really encourage us to think more broadly about designing better cities, diagnosing the problems that we have. For those of you who are designers or who appreciate design, it's a very iterative process. And so I think that we have to look at, our policies as a design project in a lot of ways, and look at, the different types of interventions that we can promote that, that start to right those wrongs, that create the equity that I've been talking about. And ultimately, I think kids are the future. Everything that we're doing is for these little people who, are inheriting, the work that we're doing. We have to protect our future, especially those who are most susceptible to, things like eviction or even homelessness. On any given night in the U.S., nearly 60,000 families are without a home. And so when you think about that, like, this is sort of a haven for things like ACEs and things that cause like early death. And so if you connect all those dots, I mean, these are the types of problems that we have to face as a society. Housing security is one of the most important priorities for families with children because we want to make sure that they're protected. And as leaders of cities and of the built environment, this work is truly our responsibility. So I just want to leave you with a nod to JFK. Ask what you can do, for our cities. Ask what you can do to help invest with or lend to developers of color who are working to equitably revitalize communities of color. Partner or work with developers of any color who are working to equitably revitalize communities of color. I think that's really important. Contribute to nonprofits with a mission to revitalize communities of color. Hire design firms that demonstrate value with diverse perspectives, making sure that the authors of the future of the built environment truly reflect the communities that they're shaping. And finally, just do it. Just start the work. Think about think about yourself as a CEO of your own life, and start to think about ways that you can actually shape the future. Just some quick things that you might consider: join NOMA. Thank you in advance for your support, and support our work to diversify the profession of architecture. We're looking to do some transformative things, not just for the profession, but for society as a whole, and having really important discussions about how cities shape our community, or how the work that is done in cities end up impacting communities of color in particular. So this year we're having our conference in Brooklyn, as I mentioned. Next year we're looking at having it in Oakland, and what I'm hoping to have us do is talk about those two very quickly transitioning cities, and the theme of the 2 years is planning to stay. How do you plan to stay in places that you, quite frankly, probably can't afford? So what are some of the policy interventions that that we can recommend? So NOMA is about more than just architecture. It's about thinking through things at a larger scale. Also, I encourage you to learn about and contribute to efforts that will reduce poverty and help close the wealth gap, because ultimately we need to protect our children and thereby protect our collective future. Thank you. So, thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions, maybe 2 or 3. Okay. So there are some microphones floating around. Have any burning questions? I think I may have answered all of them with the slides. There are 65 of them, but if there's anything else, happy to.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your really informative, engaging lecture filled with really interesting anecdotes too from your own life. My question would be, so you talked about that, department store that was,
Hudsons.
Hudsons, yeah. And you sort of showed that picture of what it's projected to look like as this development project proceeds. As you alluded to in your talk, oftentimes when we have these great projects, revitalize cities, the unintended consequence is, as you said, property values go up. Sometimes people are displaced. So do you know some of the, proactive steps being taken, in particular, perhaps in that development or others in Detroit, that are being taken to ensure that people in the community who are low income don't get displaced?
Thank you for the question. I think that the city of Detroit, having worked in city government for a period of time, I got a glimpse into just how progressive a lot of the leaders are. And I think that they're doing a really good job of trying to figure out ways to create policy interventions that help to prevent a lot of the things that you just mentioned relative to displacement. I think that cities all around the country need to do a better job of thinking through again these unintended consequences and figuring out ways to to intervene so that people do have those types of protections. I mean, I know in New York, there's rent control, and throughout the country there are there are development agreements that require certain benefits that are paid for by the developer. And so I don't have all the solutions to that particular problem. I think it's very location based. I do think it's important that that we engage our communities who are that stand the potential to be displaced or impacted negatively or positively by development, and get an understanding of what their needs truly are, and then work with them and work with again the public sector, the private sector, and the not-for-profit sector to create custom solutions to a lot of those problems.
Hello, my name is Daisha, and I'm actually from Detroit. It was actually there all
nice.
spring break, just trying to get the feel for the new downtown area that's happening. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the mixed housing income, or not income, but mixed housing being developed in the downtown area affecting like your work with single family households? Do you see like a lot of people gravitating towards mixed housing, or do you see that as the downtown development gets more developed, that people are still going to want to live in these single family households?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that certain people are really interested in living in more dense areas. Like I personally, having lived in DC and New York, I love density. I live in a condo, so it's a building that has lots of other units. But some people do prefer single family housing as well. And so I think it's obviously it's a personal decision, but I think in terms of economics, a lot of people are starting to find that they can't afford to live in some of the multifamily housing in downtown and midtown. And so they are looking to our supply of products as a viable option. Where Detroit does a really good job of getting people through and out of the city. In fact, that was part of the urban renewal of the 60s to have a really great highway system. And so a product of that is you can get from downtown Detroit to, for example, the Fitzgerald neighborhood within 15 minutes on a good day with no traffic. And so when you think about that, that really opens up a lot of the city to that, to the single family supply, because it's so much more affordable at this point than the multifamily stock that's being developed in downtown and midtown. So.
Hi, I really enjoyed the presentation, and I noticed that you focused on the color of people in the presentation a lot in like future. And recently in school, I was learning about race, and the word white space was really impacted on me, which is, a neighborhood full with just white people, and any entering of people of other color might cause like bad public effects. And I want to know how like the NOMA program, or like how city planning is going to affect this white space, or like how to change white space in like a positive and effective way. Because recently in school I learned that white space has been encountering America more than like 50% of neighborhood, which is only whites, and then the other neighborhoods are like full of colored people.
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that, but what I'm thinking about it is there are a lot of white spaces, and I think that from the statistic that I showed about the country becoming more and more diverse over time, that more people will, particularly I'm calling on my white brothers and sisters to be more welcoming of people who don't look like them. And I think that oftentimes white neighborhoods are as such because of, as I mentioned, the wealth gap. They're pretty expensive places, and so you have to have the means with which to occupy those spaces. In a lot of cases, it's not to say that there aren't people of color who have money, because I just talked about Sheila C Johnson. There are lots of people who have, but and the median is what it is. And so when we look at white spaces, we have to look at what are ways that we can start to encourage the people who are kind of, leading those areas to open up. I don't know that NOMA has any specific, initiatives to, infiltrate white space, but that sounds cool. Sorry. But I do think that it's important that we create more awareness of the fact that, I think if you're in a white space, it reminds me of, being in New York. If you see something, say something, the MTA ads, like if you're like, why are there only white people here? Like maybe start talking about it, like ask some questions, like find people of color and like have them hang out with you if you live in in a whites only space. I mean, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm glad that you posed it because, it is something that, as we look at cities becoming more dense and more diverse, how do we start to create spaces that facilitate harmony? Because that could, in theory, get really chaotic if people are living in closer quarters, but they're different from one another and things aren't going well. So how do we create, public spaces, buildings, all types of intervention that create more harmony amongst, the different people that will be living together in cities and other contexts?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was licensed in 1990, so I'm not sure what my number is, but I'm up on that list.
All right.
But my question is, cities are driven by money and dollars, and people are driven out of cities because the industry and jobs are taken out of cities. You focus on design of specific projects. Do any of your designs, are any of your projects involved with some type of economic driver that sort of brings some type of jobs back to that neighborhood, like, zoning that would allow residents to have some type of business in their home or some type of market in the neighborhood? It's something to bring, increase the economic strata of that neighborhood, because, at the end of the day, if people can't afford to live there, they are pushed out. And
Sure.
so my question is sort of a circular one to some extent, but, yes, it's the golden rule to some extent, but, how do we get more people to be able to make that goal?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So part of Fitzgerald, I didn't go into all the details, but, we, again, are a public-private partnership. And so, we are looking to the city of Detroit to do their part relative to, creating a better environment for commercial projects to happen, not only along the commercial corridors, which is another reason why that particular neighborhood was chosen, because it had, it used to have very vibrant commercial corridors to create, the kind of businesses that would reinvigorate that area, but also looking at, zoning interventions that would help, people to have, in-home businesses and things of that nature. I mean, one small intervention that we're doing as the developer is creating a workforce development program, which was mentioned earlier. But, there's only so much we can do and be profitable and all of these things. And so, we would rely on our public sector partners and the not-for-profit sector to work together to create more of those opportunities. But I 100% agree with you that, a lot of this, does boil down to economics. And, everyone has a part to play. We're all kind of puzzle pieces that come together to make the bigger picture. But I think that if we don't focus on the economics more, these projects won't be sustainable. And so, I agree. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much.
Hi, Katie. Thank you.
Incredible lecture. And thank you for really sharing your story with us and sort of bringing your full self today. And thank you for meeting with my students today from the Boston Architectural College who are here. And I know you met with students at the GSD. So I'd love to hear from you to reflect a little bit on pedagogy and both pedagogy and atmosphere in schools today, and what NOMA and NOMAS is doing to kind of create the conditions for people of color who are in school to really succeed through school and into the profession. And any thoughts you have to help us guide us both in curriculum and maybe atmosphere.
Sure. No, thank you for that. Sure.
Value proposition in architecture school today for communities of color. Like why go to school and study architecture? What did you get from your architectural education? What caused you to go to the Kennedy School? No, I just want to know, because that 2% is not going to go up if there's not a value proposition, if students aren't getting the tools they need to take on these issues. So what tools are here that you experience, and what's missing?
Thank you. So I think one of the most valuable things about architecture school is learning how to problem solve in a way that, not to say that I've studied many other things, but, design is very much an iterative process, which I mentioned earlier. And, the opportunity to focus on one particular problem and iterate over and over and over again, get criticized by your professors, and, have the intense environment that is architecture, or that, that studio environment. It's unlike anything else that I've ever experienced. And I think that the value proposition, to some extent, is preparing you for what you will encounter in the real world. And having had the experience of studying architecture, getting licensed, and now, being on the ground, doing this work, like going through abandoned buildings, like really, I don't know, moving stuff around. Like we have contractors who really build stuff by point at things and, just kidding. But, I think it's important to be able to rely on that sort of that problem solving capacity as sort of one tool. I think that the critical thinking that you get in architecture school is something that does have a lot of value. And I think that the profession could do a better job of articulating that value to our clients. Globally, I think that over the last several decades, other professions have sort of stepped in and taken on some of the role that the architect has traditionally done. And so I think that there's a great value proposition that we have as a profession. And I think that there's more that we can do in academia. Back to your question, Katie, relative to making what we're learning apply to real life. I think having studios that are, that are really grounded in some of these deeply complicated issues. Like when I taught an architecture studio at the University of Michigan. In fact, one of my former students is up there. We actually had a Detroit studio. We actually went to Detroit and tried to unpack some of these issues and create design projects that really grapple with a lot of the triple bottom line issues that that have been discussed. In fact, I think it's sort of a quadruple bottom line. Social, economic for sure, environmental, but also cultural. I think that we have to look at the culture of a place and how we can start to use architecture as a language to kind of bring people together and to talk through how space, because I think we all, wherever you go across the globe, people experience buildings, they experience public space. So it's sort of a common language, no matter what your spoken language is. And so I think we can start to look to that as a way to help to again, deal with the increasing diversity that we're looking at and increasing density. And to the diversity piece relative to retention, I think that a lot of people, I think some architects take pride in the fact that when you sit down in studio the first day, they're like, look to your left, look to your right. One person or actually both the people on either side of you won't be there. It is a pretty grueling experience. But I think that we also struggle to retain people of color in particular because, there aren't necessarily the kinds of systems in place that provide a true sense of belonging. I think that when I was at Cornell, there was a really great administrator there named Leon Lawrence who really made sure that me and the other 5 Black students in the class, felt supported. And it was a class of 60, so we were right at 10%, which was great. I think the next year we had 1, so there's work to do. And I think that those numbers are pretty standard throughout the country, except for HBCUs, which produce most of the African American architects that we have today. But for predominantly white institutions, I think there's just more work to be done in terms of having more administrators that are, being, true support to those students, but also more faculty. I mean, I think we need a lot more faculty that, that are teaching things that apply to the communities that, that people ultimately want to serve. So I'm the first millennial president of NOMA, so representing all millennials, although I'm an early stage millennial. I think that we really embrace social impact, and we really, we want to do work that makes the world a better place. And that's not to say that other generations don't value that, but it's something that we want to see happen, immediately. We want to work on projects that we can immediately touch. And I think that the extent to which academia can help give that exposure, it might actually, help to hold on to more of the people that we tend to lose, along the way when they say, well, this isn't, relevant enough to my life. I think that, by having those types of studios or seminars and having more diverse faculty, all of these things kind of contribute to a better experience in architecture school and ultimately beyond. We have time for how many more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so three more.
Okay. I'm sorry to switch. That was a wonderful response, and I loved all the questions. I wanted to kind of slightly switch the focus to housing a little more.
This is a housing lecture.
Yeah, that is a housing lecture. I mean, it's related to you and the presentation and personal experience. But I wanted to ask you about Well, I love the project of the single-family homes that you've renovated, and you started the talk by mentioning your family's history and the importance, the cultural meaning, the memory of being in these small houses in a certain historical moment in Detroit. I just came back from St. Louis. I'm from St. Louis, and I was visiting neighborhoods in South St. Louis where it's the same pattern of these really small brick homes that are in, very distressed areas. People, low-income people live there. Unfortunately, it's Trump world, etc. I'm raising this because I'm thinking about the history of kind of the culture of home ownership in the United States. And this was the promise for the ascendant middle class or working class. And of course, as in your graphic, you showed at one moment, Detroit was so wealthy and so prosperous. So we have this kind of fascination with single-family homes in American society, but I'm really worrying about the densification question. Sorry, it's a long question, but how does one, and the issue of providing enough housing, but we have a housing stock that has cultural meaning and memory, but that is maybe not the best stock for sustainability and for solving the larger problem of growing demand for housing. So how do you think about this? This is a problem in Detroit, but other Rust Belt cities. How do we think about the architectural and the design projects of sustainability without tearing them down completely? So we build on that past, but we're making them something that is really much more sustainable for a different future. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned the kind of tension between the multifamily in downtown. So there's property valuation that comes with multiple units as opposed to single. So I see it as a complex cultural, financial, and historical problem. So do you have some insights on that?
Absolutely. I sure do.
Think about that.
Okay. So, no, it's okay. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, the choice for housing, it's a very personal decision. I think that everyone should have the ability to make that choice for themselves or for their family. And I think that the existing housing stock in Detroit and cities like St. Louis and other cities for that matter, I think that a lot of those houses can be maintained. In fact, I mean, anything can be maintained with enough money. In fact, some of the images that I showed, a lot of those houses probably should have been torn down, but we decided to make the investment to bring them back. And I think that the extent to which there's demand for these properties, and there are people who have just enough money to purchase these, they should live in them and maintain them and live long, healthy lives in these properties. And I think for the the additional people who are coming into cities like Detroit, they have the option of either occupying one of these existing more historical homes or living in in a more dense context. And I don't think that we're going to see a lot more single family new construction because there's so much really good housing stock or even okay housing stock in a lot of these cities. But I think that again, multifamily is really where a lot of people will probably choose to go, and I think that's probably a good thing, particularly from an economics perspective. I mean, it's more efficient from a sustainability perspective. I mean, that's my choice. But again, for those who who want the picket fence and the backyard, I think there's a lot of space in Detroit for that, and many other cities for that matter. So I think maybe there's time for one more question. It's okay. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Kristen. Thank you so much for your lecture and for sharing your story. I do have, it's a short question, so hopefully. Sorry. So I wonder how you're challenging existing property law or building codes with some of the propositions, some of the projects that you're proposing, and maybe tell us a little bit about the process and how to change those.
So I think, Fitzgerald is very much a pilot project. And so a lot of the things that we're, innovating around right now, we're iterating because it is in some ways a design experience. We're starting to understand what some of the problems are. And, we have to work very closely with our partners at the city to start to change some of the policies that that are having an impact on the project that doesn't help us move as quickly or as effectively as we want. And so it's really about working closely with, again, not just the public sector, but also the not-for-profit sector to understand how we can collectively move Fitzgerald forward, hence the name Fitz Forward. I think that, policy is really important to creating sustainable systems. And I think that, as we continue to move forward with this project, we're only in the 3rd year at this point, and it's been a very slow process. I mean, doing things like clearing title for hundreds of parcels of land, I mean, that in itself is like a pretty major undertaking. So maybe there's some work to be done around, making that process more efficient. There's so many different types of interventions that can be deployed to really create a more efficient project for the next neighborhood that's doing this. And so it's really about documenting this experience and helping to make sure that future neighborhoods are benefiting from the lessons that we're learning somewhat the hard way. So, all right, well, that's all I've got. So, thank you.
I think the question about value proposition, you clearly have brought a lot of value to the work you're doing in Detroit. And I think I hope students in the room are motivated by the opportunity to do well, that the social mission of what you're accomplishing is so important, that having folks in this room with your talents dedicated to this going forward. So I do hope there's an inspiration here to pursue this. And I hope to Ed Marchand's golden rule, I hope that by doing well, you do good as well. So anyway, but please, for a terrific lecture, join me in thanking Kimberly Dowdell.